Back to our top story now, with the Idle No More movement pushing forward. Our Ezra Levant has some ideas for positive changes to Aboriginal policy in Canada. He joins me now live in studio. Great to have you with us here, Ezra. And we're talking about meaningful reforms, and spending more money is not solving the problem.
That's right. One of the frustrating things about Idle No More is it reminds me of the Occupy Wall Street protests, sort of incoherent, a little bit entitled and a little bit Marxist, frankly, but what do they really want? I don't see the answers from them, but can I suggest a few positive, constructive changes that would actually make the life for ordinary Indians on reserve a lot better? And most of the changes come from the law that governs Indians. It's called the Indian Act. And I know that sounds crazy that we have a special law in Canada just for one race. I mean, we would never have a Black Act or a Jewish Act. I mean, we would say, well, that's racist, that's un-Canadian. Well, we actually have an Indian Act on the books. And it gives and takes away rights and powers based on your race. I mean, that's odious to begin with. And I remind you that South Africa developed its apartheid laws by studying our Indian Act. Can you believe that?
It's incredible.
But our apartheid is gone, thank God. But our Indian Act is still on the books. Here's a few things I think we should change. Here's a small example. A lot of Indian reserves, of course, are in rural parts. Well, there's farms and ranches, but in the Indian Act, Sneha, did you know that it's against the law for an Indian farmer or rancher to sell his produce off the reserve? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah, how are they expected to make money in this society?
That's right, like, it doesn't even make any sense. I mean, I can imagine 150 years ago the idea was, well, we don't want an Indian to be taken advantage of by some unscrupulous trader and sell his stuff too cheap, or something very condescending and paternalistic like that. But you've got some of the most gorgeous fertile land in the country, and you've got these farmers and ranchers who are not allowed by law to sell their stuff off reserve. It's
ludicrous.
It's
you would never ask that of any other farmer in this country.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a crazy small example. Let me give you another one that's probably more relevant to every Indian. I mean, not every Indian is a farmer or a rancher, of course, but here's an example. I mean, you or I, when we buy a car, maybe we've got the cash to buy it outright, but a lot of people lease their cars. I mean, they get a loan for their cars. I mean, that's how we can afford things that we just don't have the cash flow for. That's against the law for an Indian to do. It's built right into the Indian Act that you cannot mortgage your chattels, like your property. So you can't get a car loan. So if you don't got the cash, you can't get it. And it's even worse because the same law applies to mortgages. Very few amongst us could afford to buy our house outright for cash. I mean, the average home price in Toronto is probably $500,000. No one's got $500,000 kicking around. We all need a mortgage. Now, the key of a mortgage, Sneha, you know, is that the bank, if you don't meet your mortgage payments, they can take the house back. But that's illegal on an Indian reserve. So no bank will give an Indian a mortgage. Because if they're not allowed to fail, you know, if an Indian doesn't make his mortgage payments, the bank doesn't have recourse.
So that is one of the big issues, the lack of home ownership, because that would, in fact, improve conditions. When you own the home, you have a vested interest and investment in improving and maintaining the condition of that property.
Exactly. I mean, look at Attawapiskat. Those folks do not own their homes, and it shows. I mean, if you don't own property, and if you're put into this slum or that slum based on what the chief says, you're not really going to keep the property up. You're not going to...
And why spend the money on repairs?
Exactly. So property rights not only allows us to borrow money to get a better home than... I mean, basically, Attawapiskat, I don't mean to be mean, but it's a trailer park. I mean, those houses are dumpy because no one's willing to say, I love my home and I'm going to be here for 30 years, so I'm really going to take care of it and invest in it and grow, because you don't own it.
And the government is also looking at making changes that will allow First Nations reserves to actually lease land for economic opportunities. And yet, there's all this backlash, but it's all about trying to find more economic opportunities for these rural reserves.
Yeah. You know what? We're always frustrated with politicians and regulations and red tape in our lives. You know, we've got that saying, you can't fight City Hall. But imagine if City Hall was so powerful that it had stuff to do with every aspect of your lives. You can't sell your produce that you grow. You can't buy a home. Let me give you one more example from the Indian Act. This is going to blow you away. Even when an Indian dies, his last will and testament, if the band council, that means like the mayor and aldermen of the reserve, don't like his will, they can revise it after he's dead. Like that's such a violation of personal privacy and rights and property ownership. That's in the Indian Act today in 2013.
Now, I want to ask you, we've got about 30 seconds left. Last word. Today we're going to be hearing from the head of the AFN. We're going to be hearing from Charlie Angus.
Right.
What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see Stephen Harper bow down and meet with Theresa, Spence, or where do you see this going?
Stephen Harper cannot cave in to blackmail because then it's an endless list. I think let me tell you some news I'm predicting. There is a secret audit that the government of Canada has commissioned on Attawapiskat. It's done by Deloitte. And I predict that there are such explosive things in there about how the money was handled that it would not surprise me if the chief, Theresa Spence of Attawapiskat, is under some serious legal scrutiny for how she's handled that money. That's a good reason why Stephen Harper should not meet with her.
All right, well, there's going to be a lot more to come on this story, and I know you'll have a lot more tonight on The Source, so looking forward to that. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Neha.
That, of course, is our Ezra Levant. You can catch him hosting The Source at 5 and 10 p.m. Eastern.